Wichita, Kansas. A quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever seems to happen. But in the winter of 1974, something had already begun. Someone was watching, learning routines, studying lives that were not his. He chose his targets carefully. Ordinary families, ordinary nights. There were no signs, no warnings, no reason to suspect what was coming. He entered without permission, without hesitation. Inside, the illusion of safety collapsed. Fear filled the rooms. Control replaced normal life. He bound, he tortured, he killed. And then, he disappeared into the night. The house remained, silent, forever changed. Morning revealed the horror, a crime scene that stunned investigators. Violence had touched everything. Nothing was untouched. Evidence markers? Flashlights. Questions without answers. Eventually, the lights went out again. But the memory never left. And the killer was still out there. For decades, he lived among them. Not in hiding, not in the shadows, but in plain sight. Dennis Rader was not what people imagined when they thought of a serial killer. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look unstable. He didn't look like someone capable of calculated violence. He was calm, structured, methodical. He held steady jobs throughout his life. He wore pressed shirts and conservative ties. He kept detailed records. He respected hierarchy. He followed procedures. He was married. He had children. He attended church regularly and served within the congregation. He participated in community activities. Neighbors described him as polite, quiet, reliable. The kind of man you wouldn't hesitate to greet. The kind of man you might ask for help. But what made Dennis Rader dangerous was not chaos. It was control. Long before the murders began, something had already taken shape inside him. As a teenager, he developed violent fantasies. Not brief thoughts, not passing curiosities. Elaborate, detailed scenarios. He imagined control over another human being. He imagined domination. He imagined fear. And these fantasies were not random. They followed patterns. They had structure. Rader later admitted that he studied knots obsessively. He practiced binding techniques. He rehearsed his imagined crimes in his mind like scripts. He didn't rush. He didn't act recklessly. He waited. He observed people. He noticed routines. He paid attention to patterns of daily life. While others were building careers, building families, building reputations, he was building something else entirely. A hidden identity, a private ritual, a system. The dual life did not happen overnight. It evolved slowly, carefully. By day, he was a compliance officer, a man who enforced rules. By night, he fantasized about breaking them in the most extreme way possible. And the terrifying part was this. He understood how to appear normal. He understood how suspicion works. He knew that the most effective disguise is ordinary life. There were no sudden outbursts, no dramatic warning signs. He blended in so well that even those closest to him never saw the other side. The fantasies intensified over the years. They became more detailed, more specific. Eventually, imagination was no longer enough. And when the first murder came, it did not feel spontaneous to him. It did not feel chaotic. It felt prepared. It felt rehearsed. It felt like the natural next step in a plan that had been forming for years. And in 1974, the blueprint he had been perfecting in secret would finally become reality. The first murder did not begin on the morning it happened. It began long before that, long before January of 1974. For Dennis Rader, violence was not an impulse. It was a process. He did not wander the streets looking for opportunity. He searched with intention. He paid attention to houses, to schedules, to patterns. He noticed which homes seemed predictable, which families followed routines. He understood something simple. Familiarity creates vulnerability. A quiet neighborhood feels safe. A routine feels reliable. And reliability can be studied. Rader would later describe what he called projects. Not victims, projects. The language itself reveals the mindset. He detached emotion from the act long before it occurred. He observed potential targets from a distance. He drove through neighborhoods slowly. He memorized layouts. He noticed open blinds, unlocked gates. He imagined entry points. He imagined escape routes. In his mind, the crime was rehearsed dozens of times before it ever happened. He wasn't reacting to anger. He wasn't driven by sudden rage. He was building a scenario in which he controlled every variable. During the early 1970s, Wichita was growing. Families were moving into modest suburban homes. Children played in yards. It was the kind of place where doors were sometimes left unlocked. Trust was part of daily life, and that trust created blind spots. Rader blended into that environment effortlessly. No one saw him as a threat. He looked like any other resident driving through town. But internally, the fantasies were intensifying. He later admitted that imagination was no longer enough. The rehearsals in his mind began to feel incomplete without action. He began carrying what he called a hit kit. Rope, tools, items he believed he might need. Not because he was improvising, but because he wanted control. Control over the environment. Control over timing. Control over fear. The planning gave him confidence. It reduced uncertainty. And to someone like Rader, uncertainty was unacceptable. He wanted precision. He wanted predictability. He wanted to eliminate risk as much as possible. This was not chaotic violence. It was structured. He chose the Otero family after observing their home. He believed the father would be away at work. He believed the situation would be manageable. Even the smallest details were calculated. But planning does not eliminate reality, and reality would not unfold exactly as he expected. On the morning he decided to act, he carried with him more than tools. He carried years of rehearsal, years of fantasy, years of quiet preparation. The step from imagination to action is the most dangerous step of all, because once crossed, there is no return to normal. And as January 15th approached, Dennis Rader had already crossed that line in his mind. January 15th, 1974. Wichita, Kansas woke up to what seemed like an ordinary winter morning. The air was cold. Frost clung to lawns and rooftops. Nothing about the neighborhood on North Edgemore Street suggested that history was about to change. Inside one modest suburban home, the Otero family was beginning their day. Joseph Otero, a 8-year-old Air Force veteran, was preparing for work. His wife, Julie, was at home. 2 of their children were there as well. It was the kind of quiet, structured morning that defined middle-class America in the 1970s. Predictable, routine, safe. But someone had already disrupted that safety long before sunrise. Dennis Rader had made his decision. For weeks, perhaps longer, he had studied the house. He believed he understood the family's schedule. He believed he had calculated the risk. He thought the father would be gone. He expected fewer obstacles. He was wrong. When Rader approached the residence that morning, he encountered something he had not anticipated. Joseph Otero was still home. For many criminals, that would have been enough to walk away. For Rader, it became a test of control. Instead of retreating, he adjusted. He later told investigators that he entered under the pretense of being a fugitive seeking food and a vehicle. It was not chaos. It was strategy. He relied on intimidation rather than immediate violence. He relied on the element of surprise. Inside the house were 4 members of the family. Within minutes, the dynamic shifted from normalcy to fear. What followed unfolded methodically. Rader tied his victims. He moved from room to room deliberately. There was no loud commotion spilling into the street. No visible disturbance from outside the home. That was part of the horror. The neighborhood remained quiet. Cars passed as usual. Neighbors carried on with their day. Inside, however, lives were being extinguished. When Rader finally left the residence, 4 members of the Otero family were dead. He did not run wildly into the streets. He did not leave in panic. He walked away composed. The planning had given him confidence, but the reality of what he had done would soon ripple outward through the entire city. Later that day, the bodies were discovered. Shock moved quickly through Wichita. This was not a city accustomed to mass murder. Violent crime existed, as it does everywhere, but this was different. This was intimate. This was calculated. Police officers arrived and began securing the scene. Detectives examined entry points. They searched for fingerprints, fibers, footprints, anything that could provide direction. The evidence suggested organization. The bindings were deliberate. The positioning inside the home raised unsettling questions. This did not resemble a burglary gone wrong. It did not resemble a spontaneous argument turned violent. It looked rehearsed. Investigators considered multiple possibilities. Was it personal? Did the family know their attacker? Was it random? A drifter passing through? But nothing immediately pointed to a suspect. No neighbor reported seeing a suspicious figure clearly. No witness provided a solid lead. The killer had entered quietly and left quietly. In the days that followed, fear spread in a subtle but powerful way. Parents double-checked their locks. Conversations at grocery stores turned toward speculation. How could something like this happen here? Wichita prided itself on being steady, predictable, safe. The idea that someone had planned and executed such an act within its neighborhoods was deeply unsettling. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader returned to his normal life. He went to work. He spoke to neighbors. He attended church. Outwardly, nothing about him suggested involvement in one of the most shocking crimes in the city's history. But internally, something had shifted. The boundary between fantasy and action had been crossed. He had rehearsed violence for years. Now he had experienced it. For some offenders, that first act triggers regret or fear. For Rader, it reinforced a sense of power. He had executed a plan. He had avoided capture. Law enforcement had no name, no face, no direction. The absence of answers created space for something even more dangerous: confidence. As weeks passed, investigators continued building their case. They interviewed acquaintances of the Otero family. They traced possible connections, but the trail remained cold. The killer had left minimal physical evidence, and what little existed did not immediately identify anyone. Behind the scenes, Rader followed the news coverage closely. He watched as reporters described the crime. He listened as speculation filled the airwaves. He felt something he had anticipated: attention. But it was not enough. The city feared an unknown killer, but they did not know his name, and that lack of recognition would soon become unacceptable to him. Because Dennis Rader did not only want to commit violence, he wanted authorship. He wanted identity. He wanted the world to understand that this was not random. It was deliberate, and soon, he would make sure they knew exactly who was responsible. Months passed after the murders of the Otero family. The shock that had gripped Wichita slowly transformed into something heavier: uncertainty. Detectives worked long hours. They revisited the crime scene reports. They re-examined physical evidence. Interviews were conducted again and again, but progress was limited. Leads dissolved. Suspicions faded. And as winter turned to spring, the investigation stalled. Public attention began to shift toward other stories. But for Dennis Rader, the story was far from over. He was watching carefully. He followed the coverage of the murders in newspapers. He listened to radio broadcasts. He paid attention to every public statement from law enforcement. And gradually, a new frustration began to grow inside him. The city feared an unknown killer, but no one knew his name. For many criminals, anonymity is protection. For Rader, anonymity felt like erasure. He had planned the crime meticulously. He had executed it with control. In his mind, it was an achievement. And yet, the world moved forward without recognizing the architect behind it. That lack of recognition became intolerable, because Dennis Rader did not only crave control over victims, he craved control over narrative. He wanted to define how the story was told. He wanted authorship. And so he decided to insert himself into the investigation. Not physically, but psychologically. In October 1974, a letter was placed inside a mechanical engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library. The placement itself was deliberate. It created mystery. It forced discovery rather than simple delivery. When the letter was found, its contents stunned investigators. The writer described the Otero murders in detail that had never been made public. Specifics about the sequence of events. Details about positioning. Information only the killer could have known. It was proof. Undeniable proof. But what unsettled investigators most was not the detail, it was the tone. The language was structured, almost clinical. There was no apology, no panic, only calm explanation. The writer expressed frustration that the murders had not received enough publicity. He demanded that the letter be published. He insisted that the public understand the significance of what had occurred. And at the bottom of the letter, he introduced something entirely new: A name. BT. Bind. Torture. Kill. 3 words that reduced human lives to a formula. It was branding. In that moment, Dennis Rader constructed an identity separate from his ordinary life. BTK was deliberate. Memorable? Disturbingly simple. Law enforcement now faced a new reality. The killer was not hiding in silence. He was engaging. And engagement meant risk. Because someone who seeks attention is unpredictable in a different way. The media quickly amplified the acronym. Newspapers printed excerpts of the letter. Radio stations repeated the 3 letters throughout the day. BTK entered public vocabulary, and with repetition, fear intensified. A nameless threat is abstract. A named threat feels personal. Families began discussing safety more openly. Locks were checked repeatedly. Routine behaviors were questioned. The city understood that this was not random violence. It was something structured, something deliberate, and the author of that structure was still free. For Dennis Rader, the reaction was intoxicating. He observed how a single letter could shift the emotional climate of an entire community. He saw how media attention amplified his identity. He understood that words could extend his influence far beyond the crime scene. The letters became part of the performance. In 1978, another communication arrived, this time delivered to a local television station. Again, the language was composed. The writer criticized investigators. He complained that he was not being properly credited for his crimes. The arrogance was unmistakable. He positioned himself not as a fugitive, but as a misunderstood figure demanding recognition. Each message revealed patterns in his thinking. He referred to victims as projects. He categorized his crimes as if they were assignments. He described planning with pride. The detachment was chilling. For detectives, the letters were both a breakthrough and a frustration. On one hand, they confirmed that the murders were connected. On the other, they revealed how calculated the killer truly was. Linguistic experts began analyzing sentence structure, word choice, repetition patterns. They searched for regional clues, educational markers, occupational hints. Every detail mattered. Because the ego that drove him to write might eventually cause him to slip. But BTK was disciplined. He provided just enough information to maintain fear while withholding anything that could expose him. The psychological battle intensified. Police held press conferences carefully, balancing transparency with caution. They could not reveal too much. They could not reveal too little. The killer was watching every word. The letters altered the investigation fundamentally. This was no longer solely about physical evidence. It was about mind games. It was about anticipating the behavior of someone who viewed himself as superior. Dennis Rader believed he was orchestrating events from the shadows. He believed he was smarter than investigators. He believed he could dictate the pace of fear. But every communication also increased risk. Every envelope handled, every stamp purchased, every public statement created another opportunity for error. At the time, that risk seemed distant, because BTK felt untouchable. He had committed murder. He had named himself. He had manipulated media coverage. And still, he walked freely through Wichita as an ordinary citizen. That duality, normal life and hidden identity, strengthened his confidence. He attended church. He interacted with neighbors. He blended into daily routines seamlessly. Meanwhile, the city lived under the shadow of 3 letters: BTK. And though investigators continued to work tirelessly, the name grew larger than the man behind it. What Dennis Rader could not yet see was that the very need for recognition that drove him to write would one day become his weakness. Because ego demands attention, and attention leaves traces. For years, BTK would remain a shadow over Wichita, sometimes silent, sometimes communicating, but always present. What made this case so disturbing was not only the violence, it was the duality. Dennis Rader was not a drifter. He was not a man hiding on the edges of society. He was embedded within it. He held steady employment. He attended church regularly. He participated in community life. He enforced rules in his professional role. And yet, behind that structure, he nurtured another identity entirely. BTK was not an alter ego that appeared randomly. It was carefully constructed, maintained, fed by attention, sustained by secrecy. The letters were not impulsive outbursts. They were calculated attempts to control the narrative, to ensure that the story belonged to him. But control is fragile, especially when it depends on ego. For decades, investigators pursued leads. Technology evolved, forensic science advanced, and slowly, the world changed. The same confidence that had protected BTK in the 1970s would not last forever. Because communication, the very thing he craved, would eventually become his vulnerability. The need to be remembered, the need to be acknowledged, the need to be recognized as superior. Those needs never disappeared. They waited, and when the silence became unbearable, he reached out again. That decision would ultimately expose him, but long before the arrest, long before the courtroom, long before the headlines announcing his capture, the real story had already revealed something deeper. BTK was not a monster hiding in darkness. He was a man who built a mask so convincing that no one questioned it, and that is what made him dangerous. The ability to blend in, the ability to appear ordinary, the ability to live among neighbors while carrying secrets unimaginable to them. Cases like this force uncomfortable questions, not about strangers, but about familiarity, about routine, about how well we truly know the people around us. In the end, Dennis Rader was captured. He was tried, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But the name BTK remains part of Wichita's history. A reminder that control built on ego eventually collapses, and that even the most carefully constructed mask can fall. The shadow he created lasted decades. But shadows exist only where there is light, and eventually,